In this session, we will discuss the drivers of growth in the long run. Now, if you see our discussion till date, the focus of this course is to study the fluctuation in economic activity in the short run. In other words, we will devote most of our time in studying why, in a particular year, economic growth exceeds the trend growth rate or inflation overshoots the central bank's target. While studying drivers of growth in the short run, there is a tendency to lose sight of the bigger picture. The big picture of the economy that we are interested is whether the country is rich or poor. In this session, we will discuss why some countries are rich or have a high per capita income, while many others are poor, having a very low per capita income. Now, if we compare the living standards of people in the different parts of the world, we find the living standard differ widely across countries. In fact, if you consider a rich country like UK, and their per capita real GDP is around $31,000, life expectancy 88 years, adult literacy 99%. In as opposed to UK, if we consider Mexico, which is a middle income country, we find the real GDP per capita is less than one third, life expectancy 84 years, adult literacy 92%. You can see it in the graph. Now, if we consider a very poor country like Mali, if you find that the real GDP per capita is 1/30th of that of UK, life expectancy is around 40 years, and adult literacy again below 50%. Now, when we look at these diverse living standards which is prevalent in the world, certain questions come to our mind. First, whether this glaring difference in the living standards has been there from a very long time period, or is it a recent phenomenon? Second, can we do something to improve the lots of the people in living in the poorer countries? Now, these to answer these two questions, I will show you some information which tells that everyone used to be poor, and if we talk about the growth performance, there are growth miracles as well as growth disasters. These we have discussed in the classroom, but just who have missed the class, it is for them. Now, if you see how the GDP varies widely across the globe. Now, if you see, this is on the y-axis, we have GDP per capita in constant $2,000. On the x-axis, we have cumulative percentage of world population. Now, around $8,000 is the average world average. Now, if you see the dotted red line, 80% of the world population live in a country with an annual GDP per capita less than the world average. Now, below $1,000, almost 8% of the world population live in those countries. Now, the question is whether this glaring difference that we saw in the pictures and now in this graph that we are seeing, the distribution of world population as per the GDP per capita, whether these differences were existing from a very long time period or these are of recent origin. Now, if you see some estimates which has been made by Madison, if you see till 1500, all countries were doing equally bad. Now, with industrial revolution, the railways coming into communication technology playing a major role, Once technology started playing a major role, countries drifted apart in terms of their growth performance. And of course, some people put colonialism or imperialism as also the reasons for this diverse growth performance. In fact, the colonies were exploited, and the colonizing countries, uh, they have benefited at the expense of the colonies. But those are matters of debate for a later time period. Now we are talking about certain facts about the growth performance. Now if you see, apart from historical reasons, we are finding that in the present time we come across instances of growth miracles as well as growth disasters. Now, to appreciate growth miracles or growth disasters, let us see this picture. Here we are finding that South Korea and Japan were the two growth miracles which grew around 8.2 to 8.5% for a sufficiently long stretch of periods at 25 to 30 years. Whereas Argentina and Nigeria, though they started off well at some point in time, but lost momentum and now are rated as one of the poorer countries. Now, if you see here, South Korea and Nigeria, they were at the same per capita GDP in 1950, but while Nigeria is jogging along, South Korea has moved ahead at brisk pace. Similarly, if you consider Japan and Argentina were around the same level of real GDP per capita in 1965, but after that, Japan has moved ahead, whereas Argentina is lingering. Now, why some countries are able to grow at a faster pace and why some countries are not able to maintain the initial advantages that they had, that we are going to discuss in this session. Now, if you see, now certain things stand out. One is we give a lot of emphasis on growth, or for countries to achieve a higher rate of growth, and the importance of growth can be seen from the power of compounding. If you see the rule of 72 tells how much time it would take me to double a particular sum. Now the rule of 70 is just a mathematical approximation, but it brings out the key concept that small difference in growth rates have large effects on economic progress. Now, how do you use the rule of 70? If the annual growth rate of a variable is x%, then the doubling time would be 70 by x years for that variable. By that token, if we consider India, which has a per capita real GDP of $2,000 in 2017, will achieve $4,000 per capita by 2029 if we grow at 6%. That means 70 or 72 upon 6 is 12, so 17 plus 12, by 2029 India will double its per capita GDP to $4,000 if India grows at 6% per annum. But it can achieve the same real GDP per capita by 2025 if India grows at 9% per annum. The key takeaway from this rule of 70 is that poorer countries can improve their lot or can join the League of Developed Nations if they grow at a sufficiently higher rate for a long enough time period. Now, if a country is able to grow, say, around 8 to 9% for a long enough time period of 25 to 30 years, it can really transform itself from a low income country to a high income one. Now, growth experience of countries suggests that if we take long enough time period of 40 years, we find growth rates vary significantly across countries, and because growth rates vary across countries, a country achieving a relatively higher growth rate can become a rich country. The growth rate is just like attaining that escape velocity to come out of the club of poor countries and to join the league of rich ones. Now, because growth rates vary, so if we rank countries at a particular point in time, now you find there are vast difference in the per capita GDP. Now if you see the growth over a 30-40 year period, here in this case we are showing the growth over say 44 years. If you see the table, accompanying table, now growth rates also vary significantly. Now because growth rates vary, the country rankings can change over time. Poor countries therefore are not necessarily doomed to be in poverty forever. Now similarly, rich countries cannot take their status for granted. They may be overtaken by poorer but faster growing countries. Now, having seen that growth experience varies and countries per capita income varies, and growth over a sufficiently long time period also varies, so that leads us to ask the question, um, why are some countries to begin with have a higher per capita GDP compared to some other countries, and why some countries grow quickly while others seem to be stuck in a poverty trap, and what policies may help raise growth rates and long run living standards. Okay, now the key to improving the growth prospects is productivity. Now, why productivity is important, you will be able to appreciate. We know that a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. This ability depends on productivity. Now, what is productivity? It is the average quantity of goods and services produced per unit of labor input. Now, when a nation's workers are very productive, real GDP is large and incomes are high, and when productivity grows rapidly, so do living standards. Thus, it is natural to ask what then determines productivity and its growth rate. Now, we will introduce the aggregate production function to depict the determinants of productivity. Now, if Y stands for real GDP, the quantity of output produced, L is the quantity of labor, productivity can be represented as Y by L, or the output per worker. Now, to appreciate the determinants of productivity, we begin with the proposition that output or GDP depends on labor, physical capital, natural resources, human capital, and technology. So, in a production function framework, output can be expressed as Y, which is a function of K, L, N, and H, with technology A acting as a shift parameter. Now, technology is considered a shift parameter because it enables an economy to produce more goods and services with the same inputs. Now, before we go to the production function specific, let us look at some of the determinants in some detail. Now, we know that when labor is provided with capital, the productivity of labor increases significantly. Like a farmer who was tilling his land using plow and ox and plow, whatever was his productivity. Now, if he uses a tractor, certainly his productivity goes up by a few notches. Now, that tractor is nothing but it is a physical capital. Physical capital, as we have discussed earlier also, it is the stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services, and let us denote it by K, and K by L is nothing but my capital per worker. Now, productivity is higher when the average worker has more capital, more machines, equipment. Okay, it is always better to have a machine do the work for you now instead of you doing the work yourself. Now, if a country has got higher capital per unit of labor, it will be reflected, or it will lead to a higher output per labor, or which is nothing but the productivity. Now, in addition to physical capital, a country can do better in terms of productivity if it has got higher human capital per worker. Now, human capital, what it is, these represent the tools of the mind, or the stuff in people's heads that makes them productive. Now, human capital is not something we are born with. It is produced by an investment of time and the resources in education, training, and experience. Now, if you see, uh, the knowledge and skill workers acquired through education, training, and experience is represented through the human capital. So, in the workplace, if you have a worker who is trained to work on a machine or to use the computer, certainly his productivity will be more than somebody who is learning by doing. Okay, so productivity is higher when the average worker has more human capital. In other words, he has got a larger or broader skill set, he is more educated. So what we are trying to say is, if a country has got more people with greater human capital, its productivity will be higher. And of course, the third factor which can improve productivity is the natural resources. Now, other things equal, more natural resources allows a country to produce more output. In per worker terms, an increase in N by L can cause an increase in Y by L. So some countries are rich. If you see the globe, some countries are rich because they have abundant natural resources. Typical example are the oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia. Now, but countries need not have too much of N to be rich. In other words, what we are saying, having greater natural resources helps, but not having natural resources doesn't act as a binding constraint. Okay, so that means Japan is a classic case. After the Second World War's devastation, they managed to grow at a fast pace, around 8.5% for almost 30 years. And they managed this growth by importing raw materials from other countries. Okay, and of course, as I said, technology acts as a safe parameter. It is outside the production function. We will see how it impacts the productivity in just a few minutes, but before that, what we mean by technology, we should spend some time. So it is the society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. Now, technology certainly means a faster computer, a smartphone, a smaller smartphone, a high definition TV. All those things certainly represent technology, but technology is also represented through better organization of labor and capital. That means any advance in knowledge that boosts productivity allows society to get more output from its inputs or resources. Like the one typical example is Henry Ford introduced the assembly line of production, where the inputs or the resources were organized in a more structured way so as to increase the output from the production process. The assembly line mode of production, which Ford popularized, was based on the concept of division of labor. Now, some people who are relatively in an advantageous position to undertake certain tasks in the production process, let they be given that task so that their productivity increases. The thing to remember is that a better form of organization also means, also represents an improvement in technology, because ultimately technology should enable me to produce more from the same inputs. Okay, I am not changing my inputs, but my output changes, and technology represents those things which is bringing about a change in output without a change in the inputs. Now, before we proceed further, let us be very clear about the difference between technical knowledge and human capital. Now, suppose somebody has come out with a better form of organization, like the Ford case that we just discussed. Now, once Ford has introduced the assembly line, other companies are able to see it and they can also emulate it. Now, if a company has come out with a new technology or a new drug or a new formula, now that formula others can imitate. So technology represent the society's understanding of how to produce goods and services, and it can be imitated by others. Whereas human capital is internal to the person who is acquiring the education or the skill or the knowledge or the experience. Now, human capital results from the effort people expend to acquire knowledge. Now, both are important for productivity, but please remember that human capital is internal to the person, whereas technology can be imitated by others. So you can appreciate the difference between technology and human capital if I give this example, that if I find that there are not adequate good books on understanding macroeconomics, and I try to write a book, a very simple, lucidly written with so many pictures so that somebody can relate to the working of the macroeconomy. Now, my effort that I have put in bringing about that new book on macroeconomics, which will improve, if people read, it will improve the understanding of the working of the macroeconomics. Now, writing the book part is the technology, is the technical parallel, or the technical analogy is writing the book. But whether people's understanding of working of the macroeconomy improves, that will depend whether people actually go through the book. And when people spend time and effort to go through the book, that is the human capital part of it. So while writing the book, the bringing about the, or bringing out the book, is the technology part of it. Time and effort put to acquire the knowledge by going through the book is the human capital part of it. Okay, now whatever we have discussed, the physical capital, human capital, natural resources, technology, all of them we will bring at one place using the production function. Now, production function is what? It is a graph or a equation showing the relationship between output and inputs. Now, all that we have discussed in the last 5 to 10 minutes, we are putting them in one expression. Y is A, F, L, K, H, N. Now, F is what? A function that shows how inputs are combined to produce output. Now, A is the level of technology. See, A is sitting outside the function, and A, why? Because A multiplies the function. So improvement in technology or increase in A allows more output to be produced from any given combination of inputs. So if we assume that this production function exhibits constant returns to scale, what is constant returns to scale? A production function exhibits constant returns to scale when we change all the inputs by a specific percentage point, and the output changes by that much of percentage points. For example, if we double all the inputs, if output also doubles, then we can say that the production function exhibits constant returns to scale. Now, when L becomes 2L, K becomes 2K, H becomes 2H, and N becomes 2N, we found that Y becomes also 2Y. Now, suppose I give, let us take another example. If we increase all inputs by 8%, it will cause the output to also increase by 8%. Now, we assume that the economy's production function exhibits constant returns to scale. How that will be useful for us, we can see in just a minute. If we multiply each input by 1 by L, then the output is also multiplied by 1 by L. So what I will get? Y by L, A, F, L by L is 1, K by L, H by L, and N by L. Now, Y by L is nothing but my productivity, where A is the technology, K by L is physical capital per worker, human capital per worker is H by L, and N by L denotes the natural resource per worker. So the issue is, if I want to improve productivity, I have to work on each of these points. Maybe I have to put efforts to improving the physical capital, the human capital, and of course to use natural resources in a more judicious way so that my growth is sustainable over a long period of time. Our discussion of the production function brings out the point that when we are concerned with the issue of raising productivity of a country, specific focus must be laid on increasing the capital to labor ratio, improving the human capital, and employing the state of the art technology. Now, this leads us to the issue of desirable policies that the government must adopt, such as attracting FDI, creating education and health infrastructure, promoting free trade, and improving the capital formation or investment in the economy so as to improve productivity. While many of these things look straightforward, but in practice, when it comes to devising policies, there are trade-offs that the government faces. People also face trade-offs when it comes to taking a decision whether to invest in human capital. Now, let us look into some of the issues related to the desirable policies that would improve the productivity of a country and hence its living standard. Now, when it comes to improving the physical capital or improving the investment scenario, now it requires dealing with one trade-off, whether to consume more today or to consume more in future. Now, we know that increasing the capital stock requires investment because investment is nothing but the change in capital stock. Now, since resources are scarce, producing more capital requires producing fewer consumption goods. Now, what are capital goods? Capital goods are the ones which can produce other capital goods, okay, whereas the consumption goods, you cannot produce another capital good from a consumption good, okay. Now, if a society, if a nation is interested to increase its investment, that requires it to take a decision to save more, and because investable resources would come from savings, either from domestic savings or from foreign savings. Let us concentrate on domestic savings for the time being. Now, if we are talking about domestic savings, if the domestic savings increase, more savings when are there, which represents the funds which can be invested. So to increase savings, the society has to take a call whether they want a higher consumption today or a lower consumption level today, because you can only save if you are cutting back on your today's consumption. Now, when you are cutting back on your today's consumption and increasing savings, and these extra savings fund the production of investment goods. Now, if you are investing more today, your ability to produce goods and services or your consumption possibilities expand in future. As a society, there is a trade-off whether the society wants to have higher current consumption or higher future consumption. Now, you can see the some economies which have got relatively very high levels of investment, and some economies having relatively lower level of investment. China, for instance, has got used to have investment as 50% of the GDP, whereas in India, in good times, it used to be around 36% of GDP. Now it has come down to around 29 to 30%. Now, as a economy or as a society, the decision has to be taken whether people or the country values more the future consumption or the current consumption. Now, one related issue in this context is the issue of catch up. We discussed that if countries can grow at a higher pace, then they will be able to improve their per capita income over say a period of 25 to 30 years. Okay, it looks quite mechanical that we ask a country to grow at a higher growth rate so as to achieve a higher per capita income in a relatively shorter duration. Now, which country doesn't want a higher growth rate? Now, the question is why we are not able to achieve higher growth rates, and is there, more importantly, is there a theoretical possibility that poorer countries can catch up with the richer countries? Okay, and we will now explore the theoretical possibility of whether a poorer country can grow faster than a rich country so as to catch up. Now, if you see, the government can implement policies that raise savings and investment, we just discussed. Then K will rise, causing productivity and living standard to rise. But if you see, the faster growth is temporary because of diminishing returns to capital. We also discussed that by increasing the physical capital or increasing the investment level in an economy, a country can achieve higher productivity and hence higher per capita income. Now, capital has got a typical behavior that it exhibits diminishing return. When we talk about the production function, we are saying that the production function exhibits diminishing returns to capital. This figure shows how the amount of capital per worker influences the amount of output per worker. Other determinants of output, including human capital, natural resources, and technology, all are held constant. Now, if you see, when the country has a lower level of capital here, lower level of capital, if an extra unit of capital leads to a relatively larger increase in output. Okay, output is on the y-axis. But if a country has got a high capital per worker to begin with, and if we give an extra unit of capital, it will lead to a relatively smaller increase in output. You can see it here, this vertical distance and this vertical distance. Okay, now because production function exhibits diminishing returns, what we are saying that if worker have little k, giving them more increases their productivity a lot. Okay, if you already have a higher k by l, giving the same increase in capital brings about a relatively lower improvement in output. And if we talk about a poor country and a rich country, a poor country to by definition has lower level of capital, and rich country has got a relatively higher level of capital. Now, we have seen just in the previous graph that the growth possibility will be much higher when you are starting with a relatively lower level of capital, which is the case of poorer countries. And as far as the rich countries, they are, because they are starting already at a higher level of capital, their growth the resultant growth is also relatively low. Now, now does this happen? Now, what is happening if you are a poorer country, because you have lower levels of capital per unit of labor? When you take up additional investment, the return to you from that investment is much higher compared to a richer country. Now, does that happen in the real world? We have instances of US and South Korea. If we take, both devoted a similar share of GDP between 1960 to 90 in investment, so you might expect they would have similar growth performance. But while South Korea grew at more than 6%, growth for US was hardly 2%. Now, what was at work? The catch-up effect, or what this is also otherwise known as the convergence behavior. Now, convergence behavior or convergence theory tells the theoretical possibility of a poorer country coming out of the poverty trap if it undertakes higher investment in the present time frame. Okay, we discussed about increasing capital by augmenting the domestic investable resources through a higher savings rate, but we can also supplement the domestic investment from the foreign investment. Now, foreign investment takes in the form of foreign direct investment or foreign portfolio investment. We have discussed about the distinction between the two when we were discussing about exchange rate movements and when we were discussing about the balance of payment. NFIA component when we discussed about national income accounting and BOP. Now, when foreign investment comes, some of the returns from these investments flow back to the foreign countries in the form of dividends, and for having invested their resources in this country. Now, foreign investment is especially beneficial in poor countries that cannot generate enough saving to fund investment projects, and it also helps poorer countries to learn the state of the art technologies and also the better management practices that is adopted in the developed countries. Now, as far as human capital is concerned, government can really uh, take up a number of initiatives in terms of popularizing education. Now, uh, we will discuss more about the education, the health and nutrition part of it. All of these go to improving the human capital, and also we will discuss about natural resources in the classroom, and okay, and also the role of population in influencing the growth possibilities of a country. Okay, till now we have discussed the various factors which influence productivity and hence the growth possibilities of a country. We specifically talked about the importance of physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technology, and it was represented as Y by L is equal to A uh, function of K by L, H by L, and N by L. Though we discussed the importance of physical capital, human capital, and technical knowledge, now there is a final factor, a factor often taken for granted is organization. Now, human capital, physical capital, and technical knowledge must be organized to produce goods and services. Now, the question is who does this organizing and why? Now, factors of production do not organize themselves. To answer this question, the role of incentives and institutions assume importance. So, to me, the physical capital, human capital, and technology, these are the proximate causes of growth, but not really the ultimate causes of growth, because we come across situations where two countries can have the same amount of physical capital, human capital, technological knowledge, but still they achieve different growth rates over a period of time. Now, why that happens, and the answer to that lies in what is known as the incentives and institution. Now, the role of incentive and institutions assumes importance because countries with a high GDP per capita have institutions that align the self-interest of people with the collective interest or the interest of the country. Now, countries with a high GDP per capita have institutions that make it in people's self-interest to invest in physical capital, human capital, and technological knowledge, and to efficiently organize these resources for production. Now, in short, what we are trying to say is the key to producing and organizing the factors of production are institutions that create the incentive structure in a society or in an economy. We know that physical capital, human capital, and technology must be combined and organized purposively for it to be productive. What kind of institutions encourage investment and the efficient organization of the factors of production? Understanding institution is an important area of research in the field of economics, and there is considerable agreement that the key institutions are the property rights, honest government, political stability, a dependable legal system, and competitive and open markets. Now, you would be able to appreciate the importance of institutions if we take the instance of South Korea and North Korea. Okay, before we take up the contrasting growth performance of North Korea and South Korea to bring about the importance of institutions and incentives, let us look at this slide. The amount of available resources only tell part of the story. Now, the question is, why do some countries have more physical and human capital and use more advanced technology? Why some countries obtain greater output from the resources they have than others? And the answer is in the institutions, and institutions shape the incentives. As I was telling you, the story of North Korea and South Korea, if you see, South Korea has a per capita GDP nearly 20 times higher than that of North Korea. And why? In one sense, South Korea has more physical capital and human capital per worker than North Korea, and this is the proximate reason. But as we know, this answer is incomplete and partial. The answer is incomplete because we still want to know, why does South Korea have more physical and human capital than North Korea? And the answer is not complete because the poorer countries like North Korea not only have less physical and human capital than rich countries, they also fail to organize that capital effectively. If you see, North Korea and South Korea, they were the same people, same culture, had similar level of physical capital. Now, North Korea became a communist state, and whereas South Korea adopted free market economic model. Now the result 50 years later is dramatic, as can be seen from the outer space. Okay, North Korea is a plain land, whereas South Korea is full of, activities represented through the dots. Okay, now why institutions are important? Because institutions shape the incentive structure. Okay, now what are institutions? Institutions are nothing but the rules of the game. Okay, and some of the important institutions are property rights, political stability, honest government, a dependable legal system, competitive and open markets. What is a property right? Property right is the ability to exercise authority over the resources that you own. And if you are able to exercise authority over the resources you own, it provides incentives to work hard, encourage investment and innovation. Without property rights, effort is diverted from payment, reducing incentives. Free rider becomes a problem. We have discussed many instances or many examples related to the property rights, and property rights leads to the issue of free rider, someone who consumes a resource without working or contributing to the resource upkeep. Now, one typical free riding instance is the Chinese experience of collective farming. Now, China, after the revolution in the late 40s or early 50s, they started the small leap forward movement, where they brought 200 to 300 families at one place and gave them a piece of land to work, to cultivate, and to give the produce to the government. Okay, now that did not work out the way it was planned. So subsequently, after some years, the Chinese government started with experimented with what is known as the Great Leap Forward, which brought 2000 to 3000 families together. Okay, we will discuss about this in the classroom. Property right is the right to benefit from one's effort, provides incentives to work hard, encourages investment in physical and human capital, and important for encouraging technical innovation. Okay, If I have to summarize our discussion, I would put it like this, that there are both proximate and ultimate causes which determine why a country is rich or a country is poor. Now, if we are expressing the rich and poor countries through the GDP per capita, the proximate causes are what we have seen through the production function y as a function of k, l, and h. Now, a country can grow faster if it is more productive, or it can achieve a higher standard of living. If it is more productive, and productivity depends on physical capital, human capital, technological knowledge, natural resources, and technology. Okay, but we also have seen instances of two countries having the similar levels of physical capital, human capital, and technology, but still achieving different rates of growth. It is because of the kind of institutions they adopt. Institutions are nothing but the rules of the game which shape the incentive structure in an economy. If reward is divorced from effort, then it leads to a rent seeking activity in an economy, and productive efforts are channelized into rent seeking activities, which ultimately leads to concentration of wealth in the hands of few. So if a country wants to achieve higher growth rate, it needs to be adopting the right institutions and also the right policies which should give a boost to the physical capital, human capital, and technology.